All right, we're going to get started with the next talk. So it's my pleasure to introduce Josh Anderson. He's going to be providing an introductory to car hacking. So please give him a warm welcome.
All right. So my name is Josh Anderson. I'm a penetration tester for Leviathan Security Group. Today I'm going to be talking about the basics of car hacking. Hopefully give y'all an idea of how it works, what common problems are, and hopefully nobody goes home and bricks their car before tomorrow. First, we need an understanding of what the internal networking of a car looks like. And it's pretty complicated. Modern cars have become pretty involved, pretty intense internal systems. There's a whole internal network with gateways and multiple protocols in use. There tends to be multiple different buses that all speak different languages. Sometimes there's proprietary languages on top of everything in there. For the purposes of today, we're going to be focusing on the CAN bus. That's a controller area network bus. It's slow and old and very cheap to implement. When you look at your cars, when you go home, you will almost certainly see CAN bus and LIN in there. Some other protocols, just to throw out some names so people are aware of them. There's ASRB bus, FlexRay bus, MOST, and vehicular Ethernet. All of these have their own little quirks and nuances to how they work, and a lot of them are geared towards specific applications. But like I said, we're going to be focusing mostly on CAN today. If you're wondering what exactly all this looks like internally in a car, this is the wiring diagram of a 2016 Chevy Impala. The lump sum of knowledge required to interpret this diagram is insane. Very much beyond the capabilities of myself or honestly any single individual person, in my opinion. And this kind of gives you a sense for why cars end up having vulnerabilities, is there's usually a lot of disparate systems interconnected in a way that not everybody who's working on them has the whole big picture of what is going on. But yeah, we're going to just be focusing on CAN. In order to understand CAN, we first need to understand what an ECU is. An ECU is an electronic control unit. There are typically dozens to over 100 in a modern car. Every logical system that performs some sort of operation and needs a control system will be an ECU. And they often need ways to communicate with each other. For example, your anti-lock braking system and your powertrain control module communicate and work together to form your traction control system. If you have a car with park assist, it will need to communicate between your radar module and your instrument panel cluster module. All of these ECUs need a way to talk to each other, and in the olden days, before we had buses, that means they would all need to be directly wired into each other. If you had your main engine control unit, that would mean dozens and dozens of wires coming out of your engine control. And that's just expensive to implement, horrible to maintain, not a great idea. That's why we have CAN buses. Because we have a bus, we now just need 2 wires from every ECU going to the bus, and they will all be able to communicate through the bus. CAN stands for Controller Area Network. It is a communication network in modern vehicles that enables coordination between different ECUs, like I just said earlier. At the physical layer, layer 1, the CAN bus defines the electrical and signaling characteristics of the communication medium, like voltage levels, wiring, and bit timing, but CAN also operates on the data link layer, layer 2. In this way, it's kind of like Ethernet. The CAN bus protocol handles tasks related to message framing, error detection, and handling collisions. It also provides a mechanism for transmitting and receiving data frames and includes features such as messaging, identifiers, arbitration acknowledgement, and error checking. I know this is all a bit dense, but I promise we'll get into the really interesting slides a little on later, and it'll all build on this foundation that we're building on here. The CAN bus, basically, the takeaway here is it serves as the central communication backbone within a vehicle connecting various ECUs that control different systems and subsystems. These can be responsible for things like engine operation, your car's transmission, braking, steering, infotainment, and much more. It operates in real time and is robust, reliable, and efficient. That is why car manufacturers use it so often, is the robust, reliable, real-time communications that it enables. It is also a broadcast protocol. So that means that anything on the CAN bus will be able to see in just plain text the frames to anything else on the CAN bus. And that'll become relevant again a little bit later, believe it or not. Here's what the frames look like. These frames contain specific information such as the sender's identity, the type of message, and the data being transmitted. Each ECU on the network has a unique identifier allowing other ECUs to identify where the message came from. These being broadcast frames, they don't have any targets. They don't go anywhere. They just broadcast messages specifically they tend to be specific time intervals to share the state of a ECU on the bus. And each node on the CAN bus is typically configured with a set of acceptance filters that tell it what it is looking for and what will trigger actions within the ECU itself. These filters can be set based on the identifier, based on the data content or other criteria. If the identifier of an incoming frame matches what the ECU knows it should be listening to, it will take it and handle whatever logic that node was programmed to act upon. Otherwise, it just ignores the message entirely. The important part of this frame, of this message that we're going to be looking at today, is the arbitration ID and the data. The arbitration ID is that unique identifier that I mentioned earlier, and it doubles in functionality because it also serves to do arbitration of the messages. Lower arbitration IDs have higher priority on the bus. That's how they handle collisions. If two ECUs are broadcasting at the same time, say something like your window power control unit and the transmission control module, that TCM is going to have a lower ID because it's more critical to the operation of the car, and it is going to go first, and the window is going to have to rebroadcast over the bus. There are 4 types of frames that can be sent. Data frame is the most common one, and that's the one we're going to be handling today, but it's also important to know that there are also error frames. Those are self-explanatory. They are transmitted by an ECU when they detect an error. Remote frames are how ECUs request information from another ECU. They're sent by a node to request the transmission of data from something with the same ID that goes out in the request. And then there's the overload frame, which is used for flow control. And it just injects an extra delay after a data or a remote frame when the bus is getting too busy. This is how fast CAN frames go on the bus. This is a car that is on, but not even running. And it is generating hundreds to thousands of lines per minute. ECUs aren't simply sending event-driven messages all the time. A lot of them are sharing their state at fixed points. Your accelerator is constantly announcing on the bus, I am at 0% depressed. I'm at 0% depressed. I'm at 1%. I'm at 0%. Just at these fixed intervals, rapid fire continuously, along with dozens of other ECUs, constantly sharing their state. The engine is constantly checking and announcing its temperature, just in case any other components and modules need to act upon that information. Your tire pressure monitoring system is constantly pulling for updates because that's also a critical system. Then it just goes real fast. If we pause that and take a look at it here, we can see this dump a little more clearly. That first field there is going to be our interface that we're listening on. This is just the output of the CAN dump command. We have the interface we're listening on. That second column is the arbitration ID. And The third in brackets is the data size, and then following that is the data field. Everything's going to be in hex here. Enumerating these IDs to figure out which does what is ID 164, what is 133, what is 13F. It's not a trivial thing to do. It's usually best accomplished by, well, the easiest way to do it is to look up the spec. See if somebody else put the work in first before you and either open sourced what the arbitration IDs are for your make and model of your car, or to see if you can access manufacturer data. Sometimes that's behind a paywall, but often you'll be able to look at the manufacturing troubleshooting data to see, I want to unlock my doors, what is the arbitration ID of that? But there are ways to manually find that out yourself through rebroadcasting of packets. I'll get into that a little bit more later when we talk about what is possible on attacks. First, we need to figure out how do we interact with the CAN bus. The easiest way to do that is going to be your OBD2 port. That's your onboard diagnostic port. If you've ever gone and gotten an emissions test on a modern car and they just plug something in under your dash, that's what that port is. This is a standardized diagnostic port, typically located under the dashboard. It has been mandated in the United States since 2008, so all modern cars are going to have it. That port will always have a 12 volt pin present on port 16. Ground will be on 4 and 5, and somewhere in there will be CAN high and CAN low. It's typically pin 6 and 14, but you should check your wiring diagram to be sure. CAN high and CAN low is what we need to connect to in order to speak CAN to our car. Also, just as a note on here, if you're messing around under your dashboard and you see yellow connectors, always be super careful around those because those are your airbags. And one of our main goals of any kind of car hacking is don't set off the airbags and don't set off the crash frame. So what do you need to actually start getting hacking on your car? First, you need something that can speak CAN. It can be as simple as an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi hat that speaks the LAWSL or SLCAN protocol. It can be as fancy as the Machina M2 is kind of the industry standard for this is the best little dongle you can get to plug into your OBD2 ports to interact with your car and hack on your car. There are cheap options out there, and they tend to be pretty good, especially for reading, but they also tend to be slow. We saw how fast messages were flying across the bus earlier. If you can only read at a fraction of that speed, you're going to be dropping frames. If you are just trying to read and identify frames, that's one thing. If you're trying to write firmware to your car, that means you're going to be bricking something important. So if you intend to be writing onto the bus, I recommend at least CANTACT or Machina M2, something that can write fast. If you're just going to be reading and doing replay attacks, you can use a $20 dongle that you get off Amazon. Next, you need a way to interface with the CAN. The easiest way to do this that we spoke about earlier is just directly plugging in through that OBD2 port. But, you know, this is a security talk. We should talk about the unintended ways that you can potentially interact with the CAN bus. All of these and these threat models, I pulled these diagrams from the Car Hacker Handbook, which I'll plug in later on at the very end. All these represent ways that your vehicle can be interacted with. Modern cars tend to have a lot of wireless systems. They have cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. A lot of people don't realize that your TPMS, your tire pressure monitoring service, that's wireless. You have little RFID chips that generate power when you shake them in every single one of your tires. I've actually played around with one physically, and if you go fast enough, you can get it to send out a wireless signal, and your car is constantly pulling for and listening for those. And that's how it knows when one of your tires is low on pressure. And just as a potential side channel attack, if you were able to send the frame and the ID just wirelessly to make someone's car think that their tire had suddenly blown and they were a self-driving car, it's going to take some kind of action. Even non-self-driving cars these days, it's going to take some kind of immediate action to try to control the situation because it thinks it's going to go out of control because a tire exploded. So again, just something we got to be aware of. Internal to the vehicle, the threat surface, infotainment systems tend to be how a lot of the high-profile hacks happen. Infotainment is also just a goofy word. That just means the entertainment system inside your car. It's your radio. If you have a DVD player, if you have anything for entertainment or the presentation of information to the driver, like a little onboard touchscreen, that whole system is your infotainment system. A lot of times modern cars have USB ports, the OBD2 connector that we already talked about. And there's always the potential for splicing in directly into the CAN bus. Once you have identified how you're going to be getting into the CAN bus of your car, what can be done? The hello world level attack for a car is just replay attacks. They are trivially executable, trivially reproducible to the point where if you have access to a CAN bus, you are going to be able to replay any packets that you want and perform any actions on any ECUs on that bus. I should clarify here, I don't think I said this earlier. Your car probably has multiple CAN buses. They will not all be hooked up to that OBD2 port. There will be, I think some modern cars have as many as 5. And some, if you want to specifically access a specific ECU, you might need to splice into a CAN bus in the trunk or under the frame of your car. But you will always have access to something over the OBD2 port. And that will tend to include your engine control unit because that's what diagnostic mechanics will need to be able to interact with. So you've plugged into your port, you have your interface mounted. What does an attack, what does a replay attack look like? The first thing you're going to do is run can dump and perform whatever action you want to replay. Say that could be can dump, I unlock my car with my keys, I kill my capture. That will all just be a plain text capture of the frames that it saw that you can repeat and replay over the CAN bus with the CAN player command. You just CAN player -I, that log that you played, and then confirm that your car unlocks again. Now from there, you can look up the spec to see if you can find the arbitration ID of the door unlock ECU, or you can split the whole log in half and retransmit those two halves to see which side your frame you're looking for is on. Whichever one of those halves, half A or half B, unlocks your car doors, you're going to go there and you're going to do that again. You're going to split it again. And then you just keep narrowing down your packet capture until you have a single frame that you can send manually with the can send command. And now you know what frame is being listened for on the bus that will generate the action you're looking for. Your door is unlocking. You can also do this to start your car. You can do this to roll down your windows. You can do this to control your power steering if you wanted to set the angle of your steering wheel to a certain angle. At a base level, this is what any hack you hear about in the news that they took remote control of the car, they could stop the engine, they could toggle the brakes, they could steer the car. They're doing this. They're doing this just remotely. Oh, it's also important to note that you can cause denial of service on a CAN bus. So if someone was able to maliciously plug something into your bus here and just constantly spam the error frame, or constantly throw noise with a really low arbitration ID that blocks out and collides with every other message, or even just transmitting on the wrong speed on the bus, they'll deny service on that bus and you will not be able to use your car. So the takeaway here is that with the ability to transmit on the CAN bus, you can severely impact the car's ability to drive and take over the car's ability to drive. Another thing to keep in mind is that the CAN bus is not encrypted. Anything that is thrown over the CAN bus will be plain text viewable by every other module on that CAN bus. I've never heard of an attack doing this, but I've always wondered why no one has just written a malicious remote start module or a malicious radio, just some malicious infotainment thing to just listen and steal people's SMS messages when they have their phone connected to their car. If you've ever had your car ask you if you want to sync your contact book with your car, that gets pulled onto the CAN bus and stored in its own ECU locally. And anytime you're going to get an SMS message, anytime a Bluetooth from your phone is getting transferred through that bus, everything else will be able to see it in plain text. Now, for the average citizen, that's not necessarily a big problem, but like if you're the president of the United States, for example, or if you're a police person in your car and your MFA messages are being transmitted in plain text every time you're in your car, it's a security concern that I just don't really hear a lot of people worrying about. Also, a whole lot of people don't make sure all their information is cleared out of all the ECUs before they sell their car, including the police. I had a buddy who talked about buying secondhand vehicles from a police auction and going in, and it just had the entire contact list and GPS info just uncleared from when the car was owned by the police. So yeah, something we need to take into account for our threat model for sure. It is also possible to read and write firmware to the ECU. That is much more complex, and that is beyond my current level of comfortability and skill. But this is how a lot of those high profile hacks that you hear about in the news get started, is people dumped firmware from the ECUs, reverse engineered it, went and found open developer backdoors, went and found vulnerabilities in how the software was written. It's surprisingly often to find manufacturing and engineering modes with weak authorization checks in place. And sometimes you can even write purposefully vulnerable firmware that you have backdoored onto these ECUs. But again, that is a great way to brick your car if you're not super sure about what you're doing. I highly recommend checking out Greg Hogan's talk and a whole lot of Car Hacking Village talks from DEF CON on this. A lot of smarter people than me have gone into greater detail about how to do things like firmware hacking and firmware reverse engineering. So yeah, how does this all come together? It's pretty rare for people to gain remote control of a car, but security researchers have managed to do that on multiple occasions with multiple makes and models of cars. One of the most famous ones was back in 2015. Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek managed to gain remote control of a Jeep Cherokee, and it was featured on Wired. They drove it into a ditch. They were able to start and stop the car remotely while it was moving. They were able to steer it. They were able to put the windows up and down. I don't know why that one's always listed. It always seems the least impressive to me, but they could do it. And yeah, they were able to do this over the cellular network. So it was fully wireless. To accomplish this, Miller and Valasek reverse engineered the vehicle's ECUs and were able to identify a weakness that they could exploit in the Uconnect firmware that allowed them to gain wireless access to the Jeep's internal network. Through this access, they were able to view and dump the firmware of ECUs, and they found another vulnerability in an ECU. This one was the one responsible for controlling the vehicle's infotainment system. Of course, it's always the infotainment system. And then as soon as they found that vulnerable ECU that allowed them to write on the bus, it was the same as if they had just plugged into the OBD2 port. They were able to send any commands, any frames to anything listening on that bus that they wanted. And that bus controlled a whole lot of important things for the Jeep. And then so that's how they got remote control in that instance. Keen Labs Tesla hack. That happened in 2016, and that was remarkably similar. I really liked the attack chain that they did on this one. They were able to identify that the web browser that was used internal in the Tesla was an old version with known vulnerabilities. They tricked the car into connecting to an evil Wi-Fi AP that they controlled, where they were then able to exploit the vulnerability in this browser to get low privileged user locally on the car, recognized that it was Linux, recognized that it was a old kernel version, used a kernel exploit to escalate their privileges to root. And I believe doing that, they managed to get access to, I don't think it was the gateway yet, but it was just an ECU adjacent to it. And they were able to recognize that the gateway had telnet, because of course it did. And it had a telnet password, but telnet passwords are kind of stored in plain text, and they could dump the firmware of the gateway, view the telnet password, and then telnet directly into the gateway. And then from the gateway, they were able to connect directly to the CAN bus and do everything we just talked about earlier. They were able to transmit any packets that they wanted, send any frames over the CAN that they wanted. They had full remote control of this Tesla. I should mention that both Jeep and Tesla addressed all of these issues fairly speedily. These vulnerabilities do not work anymore, but there's enough difficulty in overcoming the skill barrier in car hacking that there are all these brands that people haven't even really looked at. There are areas that should be explored that probably are super vulnerable that we just don't know about because nobody's taken the time to parse through the arbitration IDs and figure out what's what yet. One of the issues that I want to look into that I haven't yet, unfortunately, is just free time. I want to figure out how these things apply to my motorcycle. You go out there and Google for it. There's nothing about motorcycle hacks out there, but my motorcycle has an OBD2 port. My motorcycle has a GPS system. My motorcycle has all of these remote ways to interact with it that could potentially allow you to do some crazy, terrible things. There's a lot, if you just tap the brakes on a car, nothing bad might happen. But if someone was able to remotely tap the brakes on my motorcycle, I would probably die. So yeah, that's why this field is super important. I also highly recommend checking out JMax's DEF CON 27 talk. That one doesn't go as much into the CAN bus, but it's a great example of how IoT devices and adding devices to your car, the barrier to entry for that has gotten lower in recent years, and a whole lot of companies are throwing out, frankly, poorly made products where there's, I think in his case, he was able to find, he remotely took over and started his car with no authentication in 3 different ways by hacking on this IoT remote start system that he got. I believe it was My Car. He noticed in the mobile app there was hard-coded administrator credentials. That was one way he was able to remote start his car and anyone else's car. He was also able to do it through super basic SQL injection. You could just throw in the or 1 equals 1. There was no input validation, input sanitization at all in this application. And he could also remote start his car through direct object reference. Super interesting talk from DEF CON 27. So methodology tips, if you're gonna go home and do this yourself. The first thing you're gonna need to do is gain access to this CAN bus, find your OBD2 pinout, look up the spec, find the speed, try to find out how many CAN buses your car has. And if possible, look at wiring diagrams, look at manufacturer data, try to figure out what your target is going to be and what CAN bus you should be on for the action that you're trying to take. When you're on the CAN bus, for each CAN bus, try to find out the speed that they're running at and dump data to get wake up frames. You can find the speed either by looking up the spec or you'll need to break out a logic analyzer. Make different captures, triggering all the different ECUs, anything that you might want to do, door open, door close, lock, unlock, car start, engine wake up, anything you might want to do. Try to locate every major ECU. The big ones will be the body control module, the TCU, which is the telematic control unit, your gateway, your in-vehicle infotainment system, and your airbags, because you definitely never, ever, ever want to accidentally fuzz your airbags. Again, that's a bad idea. The recon phase here is really invaluable. Try to find any manufacturer data you can. Look up your VIN to get details online for your UDS, that is Unified Diagnostic Service commands. Those are also commands that you can send over OBDD to get information about your car and to potentially trigger maintenance modes. Mechanic forums tend to be a great help. There are check for databases.dbcs, GitHub. There is COMMAI, that's COMMAAI/OpenDBC, has databases of a lot of arbitration IDs and UDS information for a lot of models already compiled out there. That could be a great resource. Now, I should also mention, I should have mentioned this earlier. If you're hacking on your real car, that gives you a benefit because you'll be able to see all of your ECUs, all of your in-flight information exactly as it would be in the wild, but you don't have to do it that way. It's relatively easy to set up a test bench. You can go online and just order a couple ECUs for your car, whatever you're looking at, and plug them into a power supply and mock up a little fake car at home. Doing a full entire vehicle is a monumental task and is going to be very expensive. They actually have a car in a box at DEF CON in the car hacking village. I think they told me it took 6 months to fully disassemble that car and assemble it again working in this Pelican case. But the beauty of ECUs is you don't need a full, they're not aware of everything else in the system. As soon as you power them on, they're going to start pulling data and broadcasting data just the same as they would in a car. So if you just wanted to start with your powertrain module and your remote keyless entry system and just plug them in, see if they ever talk to each other, see if you can detect traffic between your ignition and your immobilizer, you can just buy those units, wire them up together, power them up, and they will have CAN communications that you can look at, that you can test, and it'll have the same arbitration IDs as your car, as long as you make sure you're still getting the same make and model and year. Sometimes they change from year to year. Yeah, other useful tools that you might need. Multimeter is really good for figuring out what the lines are in your car. A bone tool is really useful for pulling panels out of your car and getting access to some of the hidden CAN buses. Obviously a screwdriver and a light. As far as capture and sniffing tools, you can get a CAN, a LIN, and an Ethernet automotive adapter. Those will all be slightly different, but they'll all be different bus protocols for communicating internally in your car. It's also a good idea to have various different wireless sniffers. Wi-Fi sniffer, Bluetooth, low energy sniffer, SDR if you want to get fancy with it. You can do some fun things with key replay attacks if you have something like a hack RF. If you have friends that are mechanics, or if you would like to make a friend that's a mechanic, it's surprisingly easy to convince them to hand you their diagnostic tools. And those tend to have a lot of interesting proprietary capabilities. Again, they just plug into the OBD2 under the dashboard, and sometimes enabling a manufacturer mode, a maintenance mode, or even a higher paid service that you wouldn't be able to get if, say, if you like didn't pay for the fancy satellite radio on your car and it's currently disabled, usually you can re-enable those just if you know the right frame underneath your car. And if you can get your hands on a diagnostic tool from a mechanic and dump that firmware, usually you can figure out what those secret frames are. There's not a whole lot of security there. It's just security through obscurity more than anything else. Yeah. I will conclude the presentation here with some thoughts on the future of car hacking, what might be important and what might be emerging in the coming years. I personally think as more ECUs get added to the vehicle and the attack surface of the CAN grows, we will have increased remote access exploits as people figure out ways to exploit infotainment systems over 5G, over LTE, over whatever the cars are using. It is getting more interconnected and easier and cheaper to develop applications for these things, which, as all of us in security know, tends to mean people cut corners and there'll be a lot of telnet running on your internal gateway. These, I think, will become more and more important as self-driving cars become common. Self-driving cars arguably have a higher reliance on CAN communication availability and integrity for communications on their bus. As I mentioned earlier, a self-driving car that receives an erroneous malicious packet letting it know that its tire has blown will do unpredictable behavior. I know there's talks of vehicle-to-vehicle communication in the future that would allow for things like mesh network communications saying, hey, there's a pothole in the road up ahead. If you can broadcast that with good intentions, a bad person can broadcast that with bad intentions. Currently, we don't know how the cars are going to react to that kind of information because those kinds of systems are not fully fleshed out. But that could be a whole nother attack surface, an attack vector for people to perform malicious activity against each other's cars. I know in Biden's 2021 infrastructure bill, he requires that car manufacturers start to look into advanced drunk and impaired driving prevention technology as standard equipment in all cars manufactured, I think, after 2026. Currently, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is still in charge of figuring out what exactly that means. But based on what they decide, it could open up a whole nother method for people to remotely shut down your car, make you unable to drive your car, make your car pull over and stop in the middle of driving if you can erroneously trigger these, whatever these drunk driving protections are that are going to be in all cars after 2026. I personally think that probably in the next decade, we're going to see some sort of large car-based ransomware event, just based on how the industry has been in the last decade or two. As things get more interconnected, as the systems get more homogeneous and related to each other, eventually someone writes a worm that goes from system to system and just starts to encrypt everything. If there was a way to do that remotely on a whole lot of people's cars, I think it would see the highest payout of just about any ransomware that's been seen in the wild lately. It's one thing if you lose your files, but if you lose access to your car, a lot of people lose their livelihoods. That's going to be a whole lot of people that I know would definitely pay that ransom to unlock their cars. And honestly, I think it's surprising we haven't seen anything like that yet. Anyways, I digress. Here's some more resources for things to look into if you're interested in car hacking. I highly, highly recommend Craig Smith's book, The Car Hacker's Handbook from No Starch Press. There are also a plethora of talks from DEF CON. The Car Hacking Village is always a really, really good resource. And if you want to go home and do some hacking yourself, but don't want to plug into your car or don't have the hardware, ICSIM is a fully virtualized CAN bus in-car environment. You can control it either with your keyboard or with a remote controller and generate all the little traffic you can see on the top in the screenshot down there. There's an accelerometer. There's a tiny outline of the car with one door open. You can lock the doors. You can open the doors. You can brake. It's a really great way to get started in just seeing what interacting with the CAN bus looks like. And that's all I have for today. Thanks for listening, everybody. And if anybody has any questions, do we have time for questions? Sweet. Yes.
For the big car ransomware, can we call dibs on WannaCrash as the
Yes. We'll just pen that in right now. Oh, yes.
You mentioned not all the ECUs being connected to one CAN bus. There could be up to 5.
Mm-hmm.
And those aren't connected. You got to find a way to patch into some of those that don't have the nice, easy, accessible field. Is there a method to that? Do they put some of those critical systems on the harder to access CAN buses? Or
You hope. There's definitely one of the common defenses and the best defense internally for your car is segmentation. Gateways will control communication between disparate CAN buses. And if you segment out your infotainment system and everything that has wireless communication from your car's operational buses, it gets a lot hard. Suddenly you need to exploit the gateway specifically instead of just any ECU to be able to send things over the critical CAN buses. In the case of Tesla, they did have it segmented out and they did just get access to the gateway through that telnet. But in cheaper cars and in older cars, they tend not to have that segmentation in place. But yeah.
So there's no like standard around that, right? Every manufacturer's need.
Not currently. I think there's some laws that kind of are in place now about how cars need mandated security testing. I think they might be starting to enforce segmentation of critical systems, but don't quote me on that. That might just be me being hopeful. But yeah, there's definitely not a standard across manufacturers about this needs to be here, this needs to be here, or anything like that.
Last question, have you bought an individual airbag and connected it to an ECU?
No, I've not bought an airbag. Maybe I should. That does seem like fun. They're pretty expensive, but that definitely seems like fun. I think we got the microphone coming around now.
Yeah, you guys.
I forgot we're recording, so that's going to be a good idea.
I did have a follow-up to his question. Is the gateway essentially like a message firewall? Like, is it blocking certain arbitration IDs and only allowing certain ones through? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
It'll allow critical systems as needed through. And then if you have like something coming from the infotainment section or the arbitration ID of your window motor, like it'll be like there's no reason for this to come through. But yeah, it'll be filtering based on arbitration ID or data fields.
Gotcha. Awesome. And then my actual question, the arbitration IDs, you said kind of set the priority of the messages. Mm-hmm. Is it safe to assume those are like sequential, like ID 1 is a higher priority than ID 2?
Yes.
Okay. So you could presumably, if you say like, I got the arbitration ID for like window roll up and down, I could test every arbitration ID higher than that, knowing that I probably won't hit the airbag arbitration ID. Is that the logic there?
I'm hesitant to say yes, only because I'm not certain. I feel like the logic there is sound, but there are ways that you could accidentally end up triggering a crash frame. The crash frame is when your vehicle is in an accident, a whole bunch of your ECUs that are able to detect damage will send off, we have been in a crash, and it'll do things like try to shut off your gas flow, try to keep the engine from running so you don't damage your cylinders. It'll halt a whole bunch of things in your car, and I know I accidentally triggered that by fuzzing something that I thought was safe. So there's a chance you could run into a scenario like that.
Awesome. Thanks.
My question is related to like external access to the CAN bus. I'm imagining you could probably take a tire off and talk to the receiver portion of the TPMS, at least get to the wires to speak on the CAN bus. Are there any other likely venues, external, like without unlocking the car, that you could actually talk to the CAN bus?
Let's go back to this guy. So splicing into the CAN bus, I think it's a little bit like if you get under the car with an angle grinder, all bets are off. You're going to be able to find wires, and then your hardest bit is going to be trying to identify which of those wires are the CAN bus. If you can sit under there with a multimeter for long enough, you'll definitely be able to find access. I know that there are, if you were able to pop off the front bumper and take out the headlights, I know that in some cars, the headlight that you can move the headlights around in have their own dedicated CAN bus. So you could probably get in that way. It's a case of if you have physical access to the car and enough time, you're probably going to get onto the CAN bus one way or another. I personally would try to break in through the locks. I know enough about lock picking that I imagine that would be the easiest way for me to get in, just with either a shim through the door or a jiggler key of some kind. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So speaking of motorcycles, what are you riding? And have you started playing with something like Dealer Tool to get into it?
I have a KTM Duke. And what was the second part of the question?
Have you started playing with tools like Dealer Tool or something like that?
I haven't yet.
Do you want
I've been meaning to. I let its battery die over winter. And I was intending to have some information about it for this talk, but I just ran out of time. But that's definitely something I'm going to start looking at pretty soon here. Any other questions?
Cool.
Looks like we're good.
Let's give a warm round of applause for the speaker.
Thanks, everybody.